Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Democratic Constitution podcast. I'm really excited today to be talking with Alec Karakatsanis, and we're going to get into Alec's book, Copaganda, and the ideas in that book, as well as talk about some other things as well. First off, Alec, thanks so much for coming on and joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I was hoping you could start by introducing yourself and also talking about the path that led you to write your latest book, which is Copaganda.
So I'm a civil rights lawyer, and I started my career as a public defender, first in Alabama and then in Washington, D.C. So for the first few years of my career, I was representing people who were accused of crimes but who couldn't afford to pay for a lawyer. And that experience really taught me a lot about how the criminal punishment bureaucracy works. And so the incredible amount of brutality and injustice in that system, and how so many of the people that work in that system actually don't have any faith in it at all and don't believe that it has anything to do with safety. That was a real wake-up call for me in those early years. And then after a few years of doing that, I was lucky enough to get a grant from Harvard Law School to quit my job as a public defender and start a small civil rights organization. And for over 10 years or so, we've been going around the country litigating systemic injustices in the criminal punishment system. So our cases have challenged the money bail system. So the idea that people can be home with their families and their children, their schools, their jobs, their churches, their communities, their medicines, their pets, etc., if they can pay amount of money, but they can be deprived of all of that if they can't pay cash. Right. And so we've been litigating those kinds of cases across the country. Those cases that we've won have gotten hundreds of thousands of people out of jail cells. We've also been litigating the criminalization of poverty and the rise of modern debtors' prisons, issues of rampant prosecutorial and police and judicial abuse and misconduct, and a variety of other issues, including the privatization of these systems. So right now we have a big campaign going called the Right to Hug, which is representing children across the country who are challenging the elimination of visits with their parents in jails across the country. So millions of children are barred every year from visiting their parent in jail. And these are mostly people who are held in jail pre-trial, so they're not convicted yet. But the private equity industry owns the major jail and prison telecom companies, and they have this sort of a conspiracy that we allege in our cases to make more money off of the phone and video calls. And so the sheriffs take a cut of this. And the idea is that if you stop families from visiting each other, they'll have to spend more money on these phone and video calls, which are really expensive. So those cases are really about resensitizing our society to the incredible deprivation and brutality and injustice in the punishment system, and also getting people to understand that many of the decisions that are made within this bureaucracy are actually not made based on some assessment of public safety or what's right or wrong, but on profit. And a lot of our work is focused on that. And so through that work over the years, and we've grown to an organization that's almost 30 people, we're called Civil Rights Corps, we kept confronting time and time again how so much of what underlies these unjust systems are various mythologies, various assumptions and attitudes and intuitions about what safety is, about what threats there are in our society, and about what are the solutions that as a society the evidence shows us actually make us safer. And those mythologies are leading to really, really terrible public policy. And so what I'm doing with the most recent book, Copaganda, is I'm really trying to get people to understand the ways in which their own attitudes and assumptions and beliefs have been distorted about their own safety and the safety of their communities. And for me, it's great to talk about this stuff anytime, because these mythologies are so pervasive that all of us are subject to them.
I remember your book starts with an explanation of that system that you just explained, the turning people's ability to talk with their loved ones in prison or in jail into a for-profit industry and the contracts that are formed and so on and so forth. A big part of your book talks about George Floyd's murder in 2020 and the movement that generated, as you mentioned, the largest protests in U.S. history. Before diving into the role of Copaganda in influencing the aftermath of those protests, which is something you talk about. I was hoping you could just reflect on that moment, George Floyd's murders, the protests, what you saw, what you were thinking, so on and so forth.
There was this incredible period where it seemed like huge portions of our society were finally coming to understand what so many of us who work in the criminal punishment system already understood, which is that the system is incredibly violent, incredibly unaccountable, and part of some of the great injustices of our time. And as a result, people were thinking, I think, in new ways at a really visceral level, right? Tens of millions of people out in the streets, many, many, many more people, doing that reckoning on in some form or fashion. People were starting to become open to ideas that would have been shocking just a few years earlier, which is that maybe this massive bureaucracy, and I say bureaucracy, but it's really a constellation of bureaucracies. So obviously it's the police and prosecutors and judicial bureaucracies and the prison bureaucracies and jails, et cetera. But at every single stage on that process, there are multi-billion-dollar industries, for-profit industries that are parasitic on that. So, for example, the money bail industry that I've done a lot of work against, right? That for-profit commercial money bail industry exists only in the US and the Philippines. There's the prison and jail telecom industry, again, a multi-billion-dollar industry, which I just mentioned. There's the prison medical care industry. There's the institutions and companies that build all the surveillance architecture, tens of billions of dollars these industries are worth, right? Every single stage of the process, the people who make the handcuffs and the people that make the guns and the people that build the caging facilities, et cetera, et cetera. So there was an opening in our culture, in our society for the first time in a long time to asking the question, is all of this making us safe? How is it that the United States spends way more money than any society in the recorded history of the modern world on the bureaucracies of punishment and surveillance, and yet we have a pretty violent society? We have an extremely unequal society, but we also have a pretty unsafe society. So what are we getting for all of this? And people were focused for the first time in my recollection as an adult on questions of, should we be funding all of this to such an extent? And I think this was a profound threat to the people that benefit from these systems. Not just the people who are directly earning tens of billions of dollars from this system, but all of the people in general in our society who have a lot of wealth, who benefit from the selective weaponization of this system to control poor people and marginalized people, and also sort of in every city around the country to control real estate development and gentrification, to surveil and infiltrate and crush protest movements, et cetera. So if you look at American history, every single major social justice movement or progressive movement over the last 150 years has been a major target of the punishment bureaucracy, from anti-slavery movements to women's suffrage to anti-war movements, the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, the indigenous peoples movement, LGBTQ movement, you name it. You can go on and on up until our current moment, sort of the movement against genocide, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these ideas were swirling around in the cultural zeitgeist. People were thinking, well, what is the primary function of these systems? Because they're not actually very effective at making us safe. And most other countries are way safer than the United States, and every other country spends far less. And people started learning facts like the United States puts Black people in cages at 6 times the rate of South Africa at the height of apartheid. And people started learning that since 1980, the incarceration rate in the United States quintupled, or and by some measurements went up by a factor of 600%. And so people started wondering, well, what changed in our society? Did people become much more evil starting in 1980? Or were there a series of policy choices to expand this profitable bureaucracy that actually have not made us any safer? And so I think this threat to the conventional wisdom, the bipartisan consensus of more and more and more prisons, was a very important turning point for the mainstream media and for a lot of the allies of these systems in elite academia and nonprofit world, et cetera. And so what I try to do in the book, and what made me want to write the book, is I was watching as all of these institutions mobilized to preserve the size and power of the punishment bureaucracy as it came under the greatest threat that it's faced in our lifetime. And that's what I was trying to do in the book. Like, how do we get to this moment where all of these elite systems, the news media, the academic system, universities, nonprofits, philanthropy, the Democratic Party, how did all these institutions coalesce around a series of false and misleading narratives that distorted our conception of safety, made us extremely afraid, and sought to preserve the size and power of the punishment bureaucracy, which is used in service of the most wealthy and powerful people in our society. I don't really talk about the right wing that much in the book. The book is really about the story of what happened among people sort of on the sort of left side of the spectrum, among people who would at least say publicly, and many of whom believe privately, that they want a society that is more equal and more just and more free and less violent.
I think it was a lot of the Democratic Party aligned folks who were talking about these transformative changes that were going to take place. And yet, as you describe in the book, we're pretty much in the same spot, if not perhaps arguably worse than we were 5 years ago in terms of these questions. So hoping you could get into how the punishment bureaucracy survived, how Copaganda played into that, how the Democratic Party played into that. How did things basically stay the same despite this potential?
This is something I try to really dig into in the book, and I think it's a fascinating story. And I try to do it also with humor because it's such a dark and depressing topic to think about the betrayals of all of these people who claim to be so interested in these lofty ideals, that I try to infuse the narrative with jokes, and I give funny awards to a number of prominent journalists, et cetera. But make no mistake, I'm trying to do something extremely rigorous. So I don't have time to, in this conversation, to really dig into every example, but I try to use an extraordinary wealth of examples from my archive of news stories and really walk you through story by story by story, outlet by outlet, and tactic by tactic, exactly how all of these people created a sort of liberal consensus around the most illiberal of ideas, mass human caging and surveillance. I think it's worth saying a couple of things quickly, though, in response to your question that I think are really important points. This strategy exists across the spectrum, from things like what stories they consider news, what stories they push on us in really high volume, and what stories they ignore, what sources are quoted in these stories and what sources are ignored, whose voices are considered an expert, the language that's used in the stories, the context and history that's provided, the context and history that's ignored. And yet, for each of these questions, you have to think to yourself, who benefits from this, right? So out of the 1 million things that happened last night, who benefits from this story being told to me right now? Who benefits from there being 7 out of the 10 news stories on your local TV station are about a pretty poor person, typically a person of color, an immigrant, or a black person who is accused of some street crime, right? Versus coverage of wage theft or tax evasion or air pollution or water pollution or public corruption, et cetera, right? And then I think there's something really, really important that I devote a few very, I think, fascinating chapters to in the book, which is about reform and how Democratic Party leaders and liberals and a number of leading professors who have various ties to the policing industrial complex, how they were able to co-opt the idea of reform and to take energy and outrage over injustices to actually increase the size of the punishment bureaucracy itself. I think the best example, or at least the example that is widely understood by the public, is the police body camera. So I think it's a good illustrative example to answer your question. So there was tremendous outrage over a lot of these police killings, like Michael Brown and Ferguson, et cetera. And the result was the liberal establishment coalescing around various kind of fake reforms, the primary one being the police body camera. The interesting backstory of this, and the reason why it's one of the most successful propaganda achievements in modern history, is that the police industrial complex, the surveillance industry, et cetera, desperately wanted body cameras for many years. They had a big problem, though. They couldn't get the billions of dollars in government funding they needed to outfit every police officer in the United States with a mobile surveillance camera that the cops themselves control. Why do they want them so badly? 3 or 4 main reasons. First, you have to understand prosecutors really wanted them because prosecutors understood that they would very rarely be used against the police, but the volume of court cases and prosecutions and arrests in the United States is unlike anything any society has ever attempted, let alone any society that has lots of procedural rights like we do in our Bill of Rights, like the right to a lawyer and to an investigator to investigate your case, the right to a jury, right? We couldn't impanel 10 million juries every year. The system would totally crumble if people were able to exercise their rights. So the whole system is predicated on getting people to plead guilty and to plead guilty quickly. So prosecutors wanted these body cameras because they knew there'd be evidence in low-level cases against very poor people and millions of times a year. So particularly trespassing by unhoused people, drug possession, the lowest of the low cases that actually clog up the courts because police arrest so many people. Prosecutors knew that these body cameras would catch a lot of people on video committing these low-level offenses. That's why they wanted them. Police wanted them to protect themselves against their own liability, but also as a surveillance tool. They dreamt of, and obviously they understood they controlled the cameras. They could decide when to turn them on, when to turn them off. They would edit them. They could decide which stories became public right away and which stories were buried, right? But also, really importantly, they could go into neighborhoods and scan with their cameras. They could go to protests and scan the crowd, and they could link those up eventually with facial and voice recognition software and big data databases, and they could basically create the largest kind of surveillance databases in world history and then combine that with the new predictive policing algorithms. This is why companies like Microsoft and Amazon and Axon were so interested in this stuff. So anyway, all of these reasons and more, which I talk about in the book, they desperately wanted them. And then when Michael Brown was killed without a video documenting what happened, they had a brilliant idea. Instead of framing this as something really good for surveillance and control and police, like it was framed in more authoritarian societies around the world, we should frame it in America as a police reform for accountability and transparency. And so starting with President Obama and Eric Holder and all kinds of other popular Democrats, they actually got Democrats across the country to pitch this thing that the police actually had been desperately wanting. Police wanted it so badly that before the Democrats started funding it, they were getting private donations to police foundations from people like Steven Spielberg to pay for police body cameras. That's how badly they wanted them. They were able to create one of the most misleading and unfortunate narratives of modern Copaganda, which is that the body cameras were about accountability and transparency, when in fact, they were about profit, surveillance, control, and increased leverage for punishment. We have over a decade of really solid evidence. Even the federal government now admits police body cameras don't make police any less violent, any less corrupt. They don't make them more accountable. The evidence is in, and that's not surprising because they were never attempted to do that. But what they do is they grant enormous control, especially now that they're paired with facial and voice recognition, to the surveillance state. And that's a really good example for your question about how did outrage over various injustices get co-opted by the punishment bureaucracy to support more investment in the very tools that the punishment bureaucracy uses for its state repression.
I'm going to turn the topic just a little bit and introduce how I first came to know you and your work. It was through a tweet, as these things, usually happen. Shortly after Zohran Mamdani's victory in the Democratic Party mayoral primary in New York, you pointed out that local governments are incapable of solving the big problems we face because of the undemocratic nature of the Constitution. And you were responding to a New York Times article that really made it sound like Zohran's campaign or Zohran alone would determine what happens in New York City. Everything could be blamed on him. And as you point out, and this is what so much of your work does, the larger picture was missing and probably still is missing. So could you talk a little bit about this tweet and why you wanted to bring in the Constitution?
One of the things about mainstream news is it oversimplifies stories necessarily, right? These are complicated issues, like these public policy issues that are covered, that exist on a long causal chain. There's a lot of historical and other context behind a lot of the events that are covered that necessarily have to be taken out if you write a 400 or a 1,000 word piece, right? For every 1,000 word piece about something in the news, there's probably like 5,000 really long books and dissertations on that topic, So not a knock on the mainstream news, although I do suggest for this and other reasons in my book that people should stop consuming daily news as much as possible because of its propaganda and oversimplification components, and instead consume more long-form journalism and long-form content that actually gives you more of the context to understand the facts that you're interacting with. But I think the context of this is that one of the great powers and solemn responsibilities of a journalist is that you have to decide how to explain events to people so that they have some understanding of what's going on in the world. But you have to decide which parts of the context to cut out and which parts of the context to include. One of the things that often happens when politics and current events, and particularly like political events, are covered, is that most of the important context is just omitted. So, for example, we're told that we have a Voting Rights Act because Lyndon Johnson signed it into law. But that really erases like a multi-decade-long civil rights movement that built the power that ensured that whoever was in the presidency was going to have certain constraints and have to do certain things, right? The same is true whenever you see like a news story about, well, why did they pass this new bail reform law? Or why did the governor veto this thing? Like, there's a complicated story of power and organized political activity behind a lot of these stories. And so many of like the New York Times stories just ignore all of that, and they give people a really false understanding of why things are the way they are and how they come to be. One of the things about that article about Zohran Mamdani was it made it seem to the public that the mayor of New York has a lot more power and control over certain decisions than the mayor of New York actually does. And this is a problem because if you don't like things about our society, your theory of why they exist in the way that they do is important for understanding how to organize to change them and which political bodies or individuals or institutional actors should be pressured and should you direct your energy and campaigns against. One of the things that is, I think, missed in a lot of the mainstream news media is the concentric circles of power wielded at the local level, the state level, the federal level, and then globally. The United States is a very undemocratic constitutional structure, as the great scholar Aziz Rana has written in his scholarship on this issue. It's really, I highly recommend it. Most people are familiar with some of the easiest basic examples, like very, very, very populous U.S. states like Illinois or California or Texas or New York have 2 senators, but so do states that are a tiny fraction of their size, like Idaho or Delaware. And this locks in an extremely undemocratic system where mostly rural people have outsized authority. The same dynamic is replicated in most states, where the balance of power is shifted toward far more conservative and rural areas instead of cities. And so what that means is that throughout United States history, when progressive people have tried to do really significant things on the local level, they can always be vetoed by the state level. And then sometimes when progressive states want to do something that upsets very, very wealthy interests, like large organized capital, then they can get the federal government to overturn those rules. So you might see that happen if a state passes a climate policy, or if a local government tries to ban plastic straws. I'm just using examples that have happened recently. And then at the national level, sometimes, and this is a tool that the US weaponizes around the world, when the national government might try to do something too progressive, global capital will intervene to make that really not really a policy option. I'm just sketching this out for you because it's really important to understand that we have to have a little bit more nuance in how we talk about the level of power that someone like Zohran can wield. And so people have an appropriate level of expectation of what he's responsible for and what his policies can really affect and what interests they have to organize against at different levels of government in order to create the kinds of interventions that they want for their own daily lives.
To linger on the Constitution a little bit, because this is how I've usually framed issues around policing. I feel like this has sort of been my contribution in a way. And so I wanted to get your take on all this. So, for example, Sonia Massey was a woman killed by a sheriff in Illinois on July 6th of 2024. There was a lot of attention around it when it happened. What I observed was that nearly every Democrat and also supportive university professors and lawyers talked about the need to pass the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. And so I felt like an important intervention to make was to point out that that bill has been introduced multiple times and has failed repeatedly in the Senate. It can't get through our legal system. And that, the last time it was introduced, a website, govtrack.us, rated its chance at 0%. This thing just isn't going to happen. So regardless of how effective people think the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act might be, and feel free to comment on this part as well, how beneficial these acts would be even if they could get through, everyone sort of seems to act as if our political system is democratic enough to make the necessary changes. And then I add in, because you also presented a critique of certain sections of academia in your book as well, how there were academics reacting to this, and they put forward this position of, well, isn't it sort of a shame that people aren't acting, or they need to act, or when will the outrage become so big enough that something finally changes? And in my opinion, again, sort of avoiding this question of, well, how is the system designed to break these things? So I was hoping to get your perspective on that, how this political system fits into all this.
There's so much to say here, and it's such a fascinating question. I would say a couple of things. First, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is an example of what I was talking about earlier. It's a almost entirely fake reform. It would not meaningfully alter any element of the way the policing bureaucracy functions in a way that would reduce police violence, et cetera. It wouldn't shrink the size and power of the punishment bureaucracy. It wouldn't meaningfully alter the role of police, surveillance, punishment in our society. It was itself designed as something of a counterinsurgency operation by national Democrats in the 2020 period in order to co-opt and distract from the demands to defund the police, which, when I say defund the police, I'm just talking about the general kind of demand at the time to reduce the amount of money that our society is throwing into the policing bureaucracy. And that demand was very scary to people in power. And so they had to concoct things like the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which don't do that. And they had to, and, part of that also was, funding. The whole push was more funding for body cameras and police surveillance, et cetera. But I think you're getting at something even deeper. Everybody understands when something like that is introduced that it has no chance of passing, because the political system is so undemocratic and in many respects so completely controlled by a very small group of interests that even something like that, which was widely popular at the time, or something like universal health care or something like that, like they have no chance of passing. And the people who propose these bills, they know that. And instead of helping to educate the public about that and organizing to build the kind of power it would take to take some semblance of democracy back from the wealthy interests that control much of how our society functions, they just keep up this charade. And they say, oh, well, we tried to introduce it, and oh, well, like on to the next time. And just like none of these problems get fixed. Every few years, there's lots of attention in articles about how brutal and unjust and ineffective the prison system is in the United States, the conditions that people are living in there, how corrupt the police are. I had some researchers they found massive, rampant police corruption scandals in every major police force every few years for the last 100 years. And each time, and I have a whole chapter on this in the book, each time the same kinds of strategies and quote unquote solutions and reforms are trotted out, none of them are a meaningful good faith effort to actually address some of the underlying problems that cause this, right? Is the reason why these problems are not getting solved decade after decade after decade. The same tactics are used after Watts. The same tactics are used after the Rodney King uprisings. The same tactics are used after Ferguson. The same tactics are used after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and other uprisings. So part of the charade of making it seem like people in power are trying everything they can and trying in good faith to solve these problems is just the continued introduction of bills like this. It's kind of like, after every time an unhoused person dies in the street, or there's uptick in interest among people who have mental illness who are on a subway train, and other people get upset about this or something like that. There's some attempt to make it seem like, oh, we've tried everything. These are, the New York Times, one of the favorite words the New York Times uses for all these things is that they're, quote, intractable. Things that, they're just not trying the obvious solutions. There are really obvious solutions to problems of homelessness, to the destruction of the healthcare and mental health infrastructure in the society, to the kinds of things that create trauma for people. We have really, really evidence-based policy interventions that are just obvious, that are just never tried at all. So I think what you're identifying is there's this kind of symbiotic relationship and sort of charade that is constantly going on with introducing kind of fake stuff, but also introducing stuff that they know has no chance of passing, and also pretending that people are hard at work at solving the great issues of our day, when almost nobody in the major political parties and the major political sphere is actually proposing the things that the scientific evidence tells us would address the root causes of these same problems. And so we're stuck in this kind of Groundhog Day forever.
Where do you see this sort of current conversation around policing?
In my opinion, and I document this a lot more in the book, but the extraordinary and pervasive propaganda in the mainstream press over the last few years has essentially created a mass delusion. And what we have is a population that is utterly terrified. There's been moral panic after moral panic after moral panic. Everyone is really, really afraid of so-called crime. Now, what are they afraid of? Well, they're not afraid of the crimes that are most damaging. They're not afraid of the crimes that are actually costing the most money. Wage theft is $50 billion a year. That's 5 times all property crime combined. Air pollution, there's millions of illegal air pollution crimes every year. And water pollution kills hundreds of thousands of people, kills at least 5 times more than all homicide combined, right? But people are very afraid of poor people, of immigrants, of people of color, particularly Black people, and in particular, people are frightened of strangers. And that's who the news media tells us to be scared of, even though the vast bulk of physical and sexual violence in our society is not perpetrated by strangers. It's perpetrated by people who know each other. That's a very uncomfortable fact for the policing bureaucracy, because nobody thinks that more money for police and police surveillance is the solution to why people who know each other hurt each other in a society. And so what we've got is a sort of mass delusion. It's kind of like a modern flat earther religious belief, or something like that, akin to like what Galileo might have been confronting. Everyone seems to believe that not only is crime always going up, which is false. We're at the lowest level of police recorded crime in modern recorded history in the United States, but also that the solution to interpersonal harm in a given society is like more armed cops and more surveillance technology and more prison cages. This is like flat earther. We know this is false. It's like climate science denial. What the evidence actually tells us from American history and from all over the world is that the root causes of interpersonal harm are big features of a society, like levels of inequality and poverty, access to housing, healthcare, levels of loneliness and isolation versus sort of community connection and sort of levels of engagement between people in society, environmental toxins like lead poisoning, toxic masculinity, and other sort of cultural features. But instead we're told that like more police and more prisons is the way to make us safe. And this conventional wisdom, which is completely false, has brought us to this moment where authoritarian and fascist interests have co-opted those fears, have taken a very afraid public, and then they've relied on the sort of delusion that more guns and surveillance and control by the state is going to make people safer. And they've relied on that to make a huge push to transform society in really, really dark and scary ways. That would be totally impossible. It would have been completely impossible without the groundwork laid by the mainstream news to normalize mass incarceration, to normalize levels of government surveillance and incarceration that are unseen and unheard of in the modern history of the world, and to normalize the idea that crime is going up, 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 up every year. People have been wrong about that in the Gallup polls for almost every single year for the last 25 years. That's the culture of fear and the delusion that the mainstream news has created that is now being exploited. And it's being exploited to do things that I think make even a lot of those liberals really uncomfortable, because the culture that they created is now being taken to its logical conclusion and is being turned against even people who once thought that they were safe, people who thought that the criminal punishment bureaucracy was only for the poorest people in our society and for the most vulnerable people of color and immigrants, people with disabilities, et cetera. Well, now a lot of people who contributed to those narratives are now worried that these systems of repression are going to be turned against them. And now they're all sort of seeing what they had wrought. But I think, unfortunately, many of the people who are most influential in that world are still not seeing the situation clearly. And that's very scary.
I have two questions. And so perhaps in the amount of time we have left, if there's an element of either one that stands out to you the most, or if you want to try and merge them in some way. The first is that I'd like to hear not solutions necessarily, because as you say in your book, you're not really putting forward solutions. I think it's more ways to sort of interact with Copaganda. The other is this question of, as someone who uses the law as you do to help people as you're able to, how you simultaneously use the law, for example, rights within the Bill of Rights, while also understanding that perhaps the larger constitution that they're within is undemocratic, or there's this larger problematic political system.
I don't want to say I have the solutions. This is a problem that is really profound, and it's one of the great problems of our time. But in the last chapter of the book, I really try to offer some easy things that everybody can do to resist and to come together. And whether you're a lawyer or a teacher or a coder or an artist, I offer things that people are doing that you can get involved in. I offer easy tools for getting involved in your own local political discussions about this. I offer my thoughts on ways that any ordinary person can start to learn about these things, questions to ask as you're engaging with the news, practices that you might develop in your own group of friends and family, and in your own professional communities. There's something that all of us can do, whether you're in medicine or whether you're, someone who designs public spaces, or whether you're someone whose family is directly impacted by what's happening in the criminal punishment system. So I think there are a lot of things that we can all do. And some of the forces that are in sort of escalating state repression right now are relying on us feeling like everything is futile and that nothing matters. And it couldn't be further from the truth. And maybe that's a good segue into the other question that you asked, which is like, well, what are you doing with the law? And like, why are you doing it? And how do you use the Constitution? And look, I don't really know. And maybe most of my career is for nothing, because it's really impossible to use such an undemocratic and in many ways violent, legal system in ways that actually promote liberty and justice. But I'm not of that opinion. Our work has been immensely liberatory in my view. And I think we've contributed to a lot of people. We're just one small group among many that have been working on these issues. We've collectively as a field, we've reduced the prison and jail population in this country by over 10 to 15%. Hundreds of thousands of people fewer than they were a decade ago. We've, I think, helped raise mass awareness of mass incarceration and the sort of economic and racial justice issues involved in it, the disability justice and gender justice issues involved in it. These are all things that the population now is much more aware of than they were when I entered the legal profession. And I think one of the roles, among many, of our cases is to use them as a locus, not just to win the case to help get some people out of jail or to help reunite families, but to use the case as a locus for having these discussions. When we have one of these cases in a local community, people start to become aware of it. People start to ask profound questions like, well, why is our local jail determining who's in jail and who's not on the basis of how much access to cash they have? Why are we letting a company pay the sheriff to stop children from visiting their parents when we know that children visiting their parents actually reduces crime in the short, medium, and long term? Why is this happening? And these conversations happen around the cases that we do. And also, I think even in the most authoritarian of societies, it's absolutely vital to preserve that light of truth that, like in Orwell's 1984, which I write about, there was an attempt by the government to get people to say and to believe that 2 + 2 = 5, 2 + 2 = 5, 2 + 2 = 5, through the sheer repetition of that and domination of people's minds. I think one role of civil rights work in a time of rising authoritarianism is just to say, no, 2 + 2 = 4. These values, these rights that we have are true, and they're important for daily life. And children do have a right to hug their parents. And people shouldn't be jailed just because they can't pay. And the way to a safer society is actually more healthcare and more housing and less inequality, and not more cages and guns and tasers and sort of punishment. And so, like, I think standing up for what is true and just is a vital component of preserving that hope that every, I think, democratic society has to rely on if it's gonna meet any of its lofty goals.
Wow, thanks for taking the time to come on and talk with us. And I really encourage folks to check out your book. It offers a lot, not only your personal stories and the knowledge that you've picked up as a lawyer, but also how to read the media. You talk about various media scholars, Chomsky's in there, and also just personal interactions you've had, and you really break those things down. And you're right, there are some moments of humor in there as well, which help to break the intensity a little bit. So really appreciate all that.
Thank you so much for having me.